Chapter 1 NATO, Past, Present, and Future. I relinquished my appointment as Deputy Supreme Allied Commander, Europe, on the 20th September 1958, and withdrew from active employment in the British Army, after 50 years of continuous and unbroken service. I had had 10 years' experience of international relationships in the realm of defense, during which time I had been in frequent touch with the political leaders of the nations of the free world, and with the leaders of certain other nations not so free. And so I reckoned I knew a good deal about Western defense, and possibly more than anybody else, since I had been actively engaged in it, in responsible positions, for 10 years. I joined the Western Defense Organization in October 1948, and then on the 2nd April 1951, I joined up with General Eisenhower in the NATO military organization and remained in it for a further 7 years. On the 10th anniversary of NATO, I decided to write the following article. Do I read it in a British accent? I don't think so. Imagine it's in British accent, okay? Male, upper, let's say, middle-aged British Viscount. On the 4th April 1949, the North Atlantic Treaty was signed in Washington by the foreign ministers of the 12 powers, which were the original members. Greece and Turkey joined the alliance in the 18th February 1952, and Federal Germany on the 9th May 1955. The total of nations in the organization then became, and remains today, 15. It is worthwhile to cast back in history and clear our minds about the origins of NATO. By May 1945, we had won the German war militarily, but had lost it politically vis-a-vis Russia. The United States and Britain then withdrew the greater part of their armed forces from the continent of Europe. In the case of Britain, the people were exhausted after the war, and the soldiers wanted to get home. We also ran down our armaments program and turned our industry to the art of reconstruction. The Soviet Union did not follow suit. They maintained their forces in Europe on a war footing and kept up their armament production. As time went on, it proved impossible to reach agreement about the four-power control of Germany and the drafting of peace treaties with ex-enemy states. The climax was reached at the end of 1947 when the Soviet representatives walked out of the Allied Control Council in Berlin. Thus was let down the Iron Curtain, which split Europe, indeed the world, in twain. And in the face of all these troubles, there was, in fact, nothing to stop Russian forces from overrunning Western Europe, if they ever wished to do so, except possibly the possession by America of the atom bomb. It was Sir Winston Churchill who, in a speech at Fulton, Missouri in March 1946, first put forward the idea of a defensive alliance by peace-loving nations. At the time, the idea was rather frowned on, but it was taken up in September 1947 by Mr. St. Laurent, then Foreign Secretary of Canada, who, in an address to the General Assembly of the United States, or United Nations, expressed concern at the complete inability of the Security Council to ensure protection to the free world. He added that the nations should seek safety for themselves by joining in an association of states willing to accept specific obligations in return for greater security. He was soon to be proved right. It was the great man, Ernest Bevin, who had conceived the idea of a union in Western Europe, which would be backed by the United States and the British dominions. This led to the formation of the Western Union, which was brought into being by the Treaty of Brussels, signed on the 17th March 1948, by Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, France, and the United Kingdom. Again, the next move came from Mr. Saint Laurent. On the 28th April 1948, he put forward publicly in the Canadian House of Commons the idea of a single mutual defense system, which would include and supersede the Brussels Treaty system and be designed to bring in the United States and Canada and certain other nations in order that the Atlantic Ocean could be made secure for getting help to Europe. This idea was brought to fruition by the formation of NATO. It is often forgotten that the defensive alliances of the West, up to and including NATO, were conceived in Canada. An exception would be the Treaty of Dunkirk in March 1947 between France and Britain, but this was aimed expressly against renewed German aggression and has no further validity today. Let it be said at once, and without any qualification, that NATO was faced with a difficult task. It has succeeded. Its contribution to the security of the free world has been tremendous. There are two other regional organizations, the Baghdad Pact and the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization. But NATO is by far the most important. Indeed, in my view, only by increasing the effectiveness of NATO by all possible means will we find the real answer to the political and military problems of the freedom-loving nations of the world. The NATO Treaty was born of collective insecurity, and much of the energies of the member nations have been directed primarily to strengthening their defense against aggression. But to provide an effective defense within the limits of financial possibilities and economic realities demanded collective defense in the true sense of the word, and this has never been possible because each nation wanted self-sufficiency. What then is the situation in NATO today? It has achieved its object in preventing war. It now needs a thorough overhaul and a comprehensive review of its political and military structure to meet the changed conditions. There is a tremendous waste of money and effort and a great deal of unnecessary duplication. The global aspect of the political and military problems of the free world is almost completely disregarded. NATO has looked inwards at its own problems and has neglected to study what has been going on elsewhere. A member of the NATO Council said recently that a single NATO policy towards what is going on in the world outside NATO is not possible, nor is it desirable. It seems unnecessary to comment on this amazing statement. There is not even a common policy within NATO. How can you have a common defense without a common policy? In recent days, we have seen two conflicting statements, one by the President of the United States that no more ground forces are needed in Europe, and one by the Supreme Allied Commander in Europe that he wants more soldiers. Quite recently, France has intimated that her Mediterranean fleet will be withdrawn from NATO command and will be under national control in war. This seems to have created quite a storm. General de Gaulle has presumably been studying the naval command setup in the Mediterranean and can make neither head nor tail of it, nor can I. Indeed, the whole command structure in NATO needs revision. If we embark on war with the present command organization, the result will be disastrous. Then again, it is high time the NATO authorities realized that complete integration of national forces into NATO force is not the answer. The plan for a European army proposed by the French Prime Minister M. Pleven in 1950 hit that rock and foundered. What is needed in NATO is national forces, balanced collectively, and welded into a fighting machine by the closest cooperation. The operative word is cooperation, not integration. Surely we look at NATO problems through the wrong end of a telescope. We had a scare over Berlin in 1948, and now another one is on the horizon. Of course, we must stand firm against all scares and threats. But what is the point of discussing the status of Berlin except within the concept of the future of Germany as a whole? We must stand firm on this issue and continue to insist on our rights in Berlin until the whole problem is sorted out. and surely it is illogical to try to solve the German problem without first solving the European security problem. The greater contains the less, and not vice versa. And overall is another paradox. To work on the assumption that the East German government doesn't exist, it does exist. A much more flexible attitude is needed in our approach to these problems. For instance, how much longer can the NATO nations continue to keep their forces in other people's countries? As the security problem stands today, the only thing I would fear would be the Russian army. I would like to see it back in Russia, 1,000 miles away. Why not let all national forces return to their own countries? This certainly cannot be done yet, and in any case, not until the European security problem is solved. But at least we could begin to discuss it and to negotiate, and both sides to show good faith by beginning to thin out in certain geographical areas. Such action involves no question of so-called disengagement. The forces of federal Germany could well guard the NATO front in Central Europe, and who better? And why should not a United Nations setup lend a hand in Berlin and other places? Anyhow, the operative word is negotiate, not threaten. This is where I think Mr. Macmillan is so sensible. I can never understand Americans who say that if their forces left Germany, they would leave Europe. Why? I thought we all belonged to an alliance, pledged to support any or all who are attacked or are in danger. If the needs of the alliance demand that an American corps of, say, 2 divisions should be located in France, which they would, I presume it would be kept there. Similarly, for a British corps of, say, 1 division and corps troops, about 20,000 men. And if Russia in return demanded that an equal number of Russian troops be kept in, say, Poland or some other satellite country, I could see no objection. Once we can get the European security problem settled, all these things become possible. And then the present enormous defense budgets can be drastically reduced for the benefit of all concerned, including Russia. And we could then begin to coexist peacefully in Europe, or at least try to, which does not happen at present. Generally, in NATO, it takes far too long to get any of these things done because of the interminable arguments about unimportant details which go on in the committees of the NATO Council, of which there are a large number, too many in fact. There's too much arguing and too little decision. A much simpler organization is needed. The 2 basic needs in NATO are unity and leadership. The fact is, too many of us are allies only in name. We are a group of nations unable to agree how we get where we want to go. It is ridiculous to suppose that we can be allied to the north of a certain parallel and at the same time pursue our contradictory national policies to the south of the same line. Yet this is what we do, and have done ever since the late war ended in 1945. If we could establish true unity in NATO, we would be well on our way to solving all our troubles. But it must be a unity of purpose, not of mechanism. Without such unity, the result of the conflict between East and West may well be in some doubt. Then comes the need for leadership. This is particularly difficult in a group of democracies, since you cannot give orders but have to persuade. After the late war, the leadership of the free world passed to the United States. But American leadership has been intermittent in its pulsation for all sorts of reasons. On the other hand, the East, if tactically agile, has certainly been systematic. I reckon the time has come for a change. Britain must now come forward and supply the consistency, acting as a sort of moral broker. We can't go it alone. And the difficulty is to make the rest of the free world go it together. That is where our brokerage should come in, as Mr. Macmillan is at present showing, and very well too. It is unfortunate that we are always having to cork up colonial leaks, e.g., ergo Kenya, Malta, Cyprus, and now Central Africa. This takes our eyes off the ball. Also, however unjustifiably, it gives scope to those Americans who adopt an attitude of holier-than-thou anti-colonialism. And even more unjustifiably, it makes it easier for the Russians to portray us to colonial peoples as old-fashioned exploiters. The crux of the whole matter is this. We admit at once that the achievements of NATO have been terrific. We have stopped a major war in Europe, nor will there be one in any foreseeable future so long as NATO is strong in unity and leadership. We have learned to work alongside each other. And all too slowly, some, but not all, are beginning to realize that we must look outwards if we are to win the next round of the contest between East and West, not just inwards at ourselves. But if we are to do this effectively, we must have an agreed policy which links NATO with the world outside NATO, and this we have not got. If NATO is to survive and become the vigorous and healthy organization we all desire, there must be changes. The first requirement is a thorough review of the whole organization. Those who drafted the treaty obviously had this in mind. Article 12 reads as follows. After the treaty has been in force for 10 years, or at any time thereafter, the parties shall, if any of them so requests, consult together for the purpose of reviewing the treaty, having regard for the factors then affecting peace and security in the North Atlantic area. Well, the treaty has been in force for 10 years. Here then is the authority for reviewing the whole organization, and in particular, the military structure. A major trouble is that, the standing group being in Washington and the permanent council being in Paris, the council tends to get its military advice from the supreme commander at SHAPE, capital S-H-A-P-E, capital S, capital H, capital A, capital P, capital E, which is altogether wrong. It should come from the Military Committee of NATO, composed of the chiefs of staff of the NATO countries. This unsound method of working has tended to make the Supreme Commander the most powerful personality in the organization, whereas the Secretary General should have this position. The review I have suggested would take all these matters into close consideration, but it would have to be carried out by a very small committee under a very strong chairman. And none of them should be serving in the NATO organization today. Unless this happened, nothing would happen. The greater danger facing NATO today is complacency. Perhaps apathy is a better word. It has often seemed to me that NATO is becoming sort of mutual congratulation society, thinking all is well and refusing to face facts. After a successful battle, the good general is he who looks over his army, examining where things need improvement, where the organization is cumbersome, where the command structure failed, where changes would be desirable, where there is waste and inefficiency, and so on. NATO should now do the same. It has won a successful battle. This then is time for a review and overhaul of the whole organization in order to progress. Change is inevitable. Progress is not inevitable. Progress depends on courage to face the facts and then to make sound decisions based on those facts. Only if it acts in this way can NATO go forward with confidence and into the future. This was published in the Sunday Times on March 29th, March 1959.